you to make you small so you don't take risks, so you don't get out there and get hurt again. But they're all desperately trying to protect you, even though they're tearing into you. Is this making any sense? Okay. But there's lots of kinds of managers. I'm just focusing on the critics because that's an interesting topic for this group, I think. So they try their best. Much of the time they're successful. They got you through graduate school. They got you into the jobs you're in. They keep you looking good in this corporate environment. And still, the world has a way of breaking through their defenses and triggering your exiles, at which point it's a big emergency. And there's a set of parts who has to deal with that emergency immediately and get you higher than those flames of emotion, or distract you so you burn itself out, or get you out of your body somehow, or somehow deal with this 4-alarm fire that's happening inside of you. So we call them firefighters. It's a different category of protector. And in contrast to the managers, who often are so careful and controlling, and they are impulsive and take you out of control, and damn the torpedoes, they're going to do whatever it takes, regardless of the collateral damage, regardless of the damage to your body, your relationships, in Trump's case, to the world. He's got a tweet at 4 in the morning. That's his firefighter activity, one of them. So we all have firefighter activities. And I'm going to give you a chance to call yours out. So when you get triggered, when your exiles really feel upset, what's your first impulse? Just call it out. Eating is one of mine. Running, I wish was one of mine. What? Isolate, withdraw, right? Sulking is one of mine, says my wife. Fire off an email that you wish you didn't send, that's right. Yeah. Controlling, okay. Swearing. Okay. So most of these are pretty benign, but if you're working with trauma like I do, you'll also have cutting, and you'll have all sorts of addictions, and you'll have lots of rage, and the kinds of firefighters that get people diagnosed and get them into institutions and so on. So we all have firefighter activities. Most of us have a hierarchy of them. If the first one doesn't work, we go to the next one. If that doesn't work, the next one. And one that wasn't mentioned so far is at the top of that hierarchy for most people. Any guesses about that? Suicide, right. It's such a relief to know that that's a possibility for most people, for most clients. And here we come along as well-meaning therapists and say, I want you to sign this contract saying you're not going to kill yourself. And you wonder why your client goes crazy. You took away their safety net. So this is the map, to go back to your question. And they all do have relationships with each other. Many managers are polarized with firefighters. They're trying to control the addiction because it's ruining their lives, even though the addiction is desperately trying to deal with the worthlessness that's in there. And so the addicted part is rebelling against the controlling, and then you come in as a therapist and side with the manager to try and so you follow all this? Okay. Yeah.
You then distinguish between within firefight activities the sort of the choice, element of choice versus reaction. So
with firefighter activity?
Fever is a bodily reaction, right? There's also maybe a form of firefighter.
Yeah, so
the choice of suicide.
Yes. Sometimes it's a very unconscious, impulsive act, which would be a firefighter activity. Sometimes it's more of a soothing, managerial kind of thing, suicide. But my conversation with that suicide part is why do you want to kill him? What are you afraid would happen if you didn't kill him? What do you think the answers to that question are? It's two common answers.
To keep him safe.
What?
Nagyon fasz a Vietnam újra
More
az
pain.
első missziót.
I can't stand the pain he's in. He's going to get more of it. Let's just call it. Yeah.
Igen,
It's the
láttam.
most common answer. So I'll say to that part, I totally get that. I totally appreciate why you would want to comfort him or take care of him this way.
Amúgy nem is beszélek hangosan.
If you would give me a chance, I can show you we can get him out of his pain in a different way. Would you give us a chance to prove that? I don't think you can do that. No, I guarantee we can do that. Would you give me a chance
Tegnap
to
nem
prove it?
beszélgettem.
So the biggest antidote to suicide is hope. And worked for 20 years with a chronically suicidal population with that basic premise and almost never hospitalized anybody and didn't lose anybody. So you see, this is a very big paradigm shift for all these kinds of things, for addictive parts, for all kinds of parts, yeah.
Can you link what you're now saying to what you said about noticing that people got worse when they left your office? What
Yes, I
was
will. I'll cycle back to that. What was my mistake? So clients would come in and we'd get to know their parts, and they would be talking about these parts that were so hurt and young and vulnerable, and it felt like that's what we need to heal. So I would do my best to get there as soon as I could. And it was those sessions that the clients would have these big backlash reactions. And what I learned the hard way was I was violating the rules of these protective parts who had kept those vulnerable parts locked away for 30 years. And here I come and I open the door right away. And they're punishing my client for having let that happen. Does that make sense? So we learned the hard way to never do that. So now we go to protectors first. We go to them not expecting them to change. We go to them with that message of hope and to honor them for their service, like you might the military, and to learn about what they protect, and then negotiate with that question of what are you afraid would happen if we didn't do this, if you didn't do this? Would you give us permission to go and fix that so you don't have to stay in this role? And if you didn't have to stay in this role, what might you like to do instead? And you'll be amazed by the answers. It's often the exact opposite of what they've been doing. So the critic now wants to be your cheerleader, or the one who makes you withdraw now wants to get you out there. That's their naturally valuable state. So we're trying to free up these protectors, but they will not go for any of that until what they protect has been healed. And what do I mean by healed? And how do we heal these exiles? So, I negotiate permission from a protector. Sometimes it takes quite a while. There's a lot of fear about opening that door to the exiles. Now, over the years, we know how to address each of the common fears. The biggest fear is you'll be overwhelmed. All that raw affect will just swamp you, flood you, you won't be able to function. So we, over the years, learned how to keep that from happening, which actually turns out to be incredibly simple, which simply is to ask the exile if it's willing to not overwhelm. And if it agrees to not overwhelm, they never do. So we'll set that up in advance. And now I'm having my client focus on that part that feels so much humiliation or terror or raw pain or shame, whatever you did exile. Find it in your body. This is how we start with parts. And then, how do you feel toward that part of you? Which is the question we ask after every time we meet a part. How do you feel toward this young, hurt part of you? In answering that question, we learn how much self is present. So if it's one of those C words, we know maybe we've got enough self to actually begin a dialogue. If it's something else, I'm afraid of it, or I don't like it, or, you know, then you ask those parts to step back more until you get, I feel sorry for it, I'd like to help it. Once they're in that state, let it know you'd like to help it, see what it wants you to know. Answers start to come. Sometimes people start seeing scenes from their past where the part is stuck in the past. Sometimes not. Sometimes the little childlike part rejects the self. Where were you when I needed you? You locked me up for 20 years. Why should I like you? Why should I trust you or listen to you? And we have to do a repair. We have to have self apologize for having done that. Until there is a trusting relationship between that young part and yourself. At which point, I would have you ask that child what it wants you to know about the past and where it's stuck in the past. And clients see scenes, feel emotion, feel the sensation, not reliving it because the part hasn't overwhelmed them, hasn't taken over, but self is witnessing what happened in a new way. You're becoming a compassionate witness to your own history. And there's something very healing about that for these parts. And it's not that I'm the witness, it's that yourself is the witness. And when the part feels fully witnessed, it's still living back there. So I would say to you, I'd like you now to go into that scene and be with that little girl in the way she needed back then. And clients, okay, I'm there. What are you doing? Well, I'm holding her, and I'm pushing my father away. Okay, and I'm just kind of, okay, now what? Now what's going to happen? Okay, okay, now what are you going to do? And the client just is doing it. And then when we're ready, we take the part out of that place to a safe place, at which point they're willing to unload these emotions and beliefs that have been driving them, at which point, when they do that, they transform into their naturally valuable states. At which point, we bring in all the protectors to see that this one doesn't need to be protected anymore, because it's just a happy little inner girl who now wants to go and play. At which point, we ask them, now are you guys ready for a new job? And they are. They're just eager for a new job. They hate the jobs they've been in. So, there you have it. I don't think I've ever taught the model that quickly. How are we doing for time? I've got 5 minutes, is that true? Oh my God, okay. Yeah.
So, how do you recommend working with this with oneself?
You know, if I had more time, I'd have you do, all right, we're gonna do it. Okay, all right. So, take a second, put your stuff down. Think of a protective part of you you'd like to get to know that you usually have been fighting with because it gets in the way in your life. And maybe it is that critic. I mean, we all have one of those. That might be the simplest thing. It's just to take a second and focus on that critical voice inside of you and find it in your body or around your body. And then as you notice it, notice how you feel toward that critic. In other words, are you intimidated by it? Or do you depend on it? You hate it? Want to get rid of it? You have a relationship with this part of you. It might be a combination of those feelings. Just notice how you feel toward this critical part of you. And then, if it's possible, we're going to ask these other parts to give you space to just get to know it for a second. Just to let you be mindfully curious about it. just for a second. We're not giving it more power to take over and run and hurt you. We just want to get to know it. And if you can't get there, that's fine. You can just get to know the parts that are afraid. But if you can get even a little bit curious about this or toward this critic, then go ahead and ask what it wants you to know about itself. And don't think of the answer. So many thinking parts can step out too. Just wait for an answer to come from that place in your body. What does it want you to know? And what's it afraid would happen if it didn't criticize you all the time? What's it afraid would happen? Just wait for the answer. If you do get an answer to that question, it means it lets you know something about what it's protecting. And see if it's possible to extend some appreciation to it for trying to protect you that way. Even if it's hurtful sometimes, just let it know you get that it's trying to keep you safe. And see how it reacts to that appreciation. Another question is, if you could heal or change what it protects, so it was freed of this responsibility, if you could heal or change what it protects, so it was liberated from this job, what might it like to do instead inside of you? Ask it also how old it thinks you are. Not how old it is. How old does it think you are? And if it thinks you're younger than you are, then just update it. See how it reacts. And last question is, ask this part what it needs from you in the future. And then the time feels right, you can shift your focus back out here, thanking that part for whatever it lets you know if you got that far. So I know we don't have a lot of time. I would love to just gather a few reports, if anybody were willing to talk about what that was like. Let me just start by just asking, how many of you had a kind of interesting experience with that? Okay. Anybody willing to talk about it? Any level of detail that feels safe is fine. Yeah.
So first, such an honor to be in the room with you.
Oh my God. Thank you.
I just have to say
Thank you.
I also have the baseball card. I actually had a wonderful thing happen, which was when I felt it so strongly in my heart. And I've done work on the critic, a lot of work. But when I said to the critic that what they would rather do, what was the second question? What was the second
What was it protecting? What's it afraid would happen if it didn't?
When I appreciated it,
Uh-huh.
because it was hurt, I felt it very physically. It was
Yeah.
hurting.
Yeah.
The pain stopped completely.
That's all they want. They want a little appreciation.
It just stopped.
That's right.
And when I asked it what it would rather do, it said it would like to just take a break.
Hmm.
It was very
That's the
clear.
number one answer to that question.
I would like to take a break. And then when I asked how old it thought I was, 7.
Mhm.
And when I informed it that I was significantly older, it said, "Oh my God, right, I'm off then." And then when it said, "What do you most need from me?" Just keep reminding me you're not 7.
That's fantastic.
It was just very clear.
That's
So
excellent.
thank you.
Thank you for sharing all that. Maybe one or two more, anybody? Yeah.
It had even a strategy for me. It was very clear, so I had very similar. And I was working yesterday in my track, and my tendency is to protect everybody around me and to take on. So it was my critic just said, "So what do you need?" And just set your own boundaries so I don't have to do it. And it was just so clear from your adult perspective. So it had a very clear strategy.
It's great.
With very clear manifestation. I can see it even in my work.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you.
Can you be in my pocket?
No, but you can. You already are there. So, yeah. Yeah.
So, I have your baseball cards too, as you know.
Price is going up, actually.
So my excitement is to take this model and continue to use it in my role as a coach to CEOs and to vice presidents and such. Can you speak to that for a few minutes?
Do I have a few minutes? Okay. So I've worked with clients who were CEOs frequently. Most of them had pretty traumatic childhoods. Their protectors, their managers said, never again am I going to be humiliated, and got into this very striving kind of workaholic, perfectionistic place that served them through school, served them climbing the ladder, but drive all their employees crazy because they're dominated by those parts. Does that sound familiar? So you go to those parts the same way I just had you go to your critics, and you honor them for getting them safe and there, and what do you protect? And you go and you find the little 7-year-olds that struck out in Little League, and that's one of mine. And you help it, I mean, and worse traumas. Right. And you heal it, and then you go to the striving one, and you get it to change its role, and the client leads from self. And now, because parts are contagious, so if your company is run by a part like that, it's going to trickle down to everybody, one form or another. You're either going to be in these scared parts or these pleasing parts all the time, or the parts that have to, like Donald Trump, tell how great he is all the time. And self is also contagious. So if you can get your CEO into self, then everybody relaxes. And it brings out self in all the employees, and you have a self-led company. So anyway, that's part of my vision.
And can I actually do that if I'm not sort of the therapist kind of person?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't do your job, so I don't know what the limits are. But there's a lot of this you can just bring up in conversation because people know what you're talking about when you say, oh, so part of you does this to you and another part tells you this, and this part doesn't serve you, does it? No, it doesn't. Okay, would you like some help with that? I can help you with that. And particularly if you stay at the level of protectors like we just did with the critic, it's very safe. You don't have to, once you go to exiles, it can get dicey, at which point either get the training or refer to a therapist. But just the language and then having people get to know their protectors and change their relationship with their protectors, get a little separation from the protectors, is very useful. Yeah. How much time do I want to?
If you're going to do one more, we should call that the last.
All right, last one. Yes.
So I'm curious how resilient these parts are, these old patterns and habits that we've been carrying around for decades. Like how resilient are they to come back, and how much maintenance and attention do they need? Because do they come back to their familiar place?
Yeah, well, in the early days when I was doing this, I would get all excited in the office, and then the next session was back.
Yep.
And so I learned that there's a maintenance to it. So homework to clients is you just got to know this critic in a different way, be with it every day this way for about 3 weeks, and that'll make a big shift. So it's that kind of thing. And people can do it. Most people, this becomes a kind of life practice. Just getting to know your parts as they come up and starting to work with them in different ways from self. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed being with you. So now we do have what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership. Oddly enough, all the qualities began with the letter C. So curiosity is often the first one to show up. First, they're really furious or they're terrified of the part. That steps back. Now, how do you feel toward it? I'm just kind of curious about why it does this inside of me. Also calm, where they were agitated or scared before. Also confident relative to it, that no longer intimidates them. And often compassion. And I feel sorry for having to do this job inside. So those are 4 of the 8 C's. Then also clarity in the sense that the image of the part would actually change. Looked like a monster, and now it looks like a teenage kid maybe. Creativity. When they were in their parts, they had a very limited range of ways to relate to this one. Now, all kinds of things are possible and how they relate to it. And courage. Not only are they not intimidated by the part, but they now have the courage that they didn't used to have to go to what it protects and actually start to heal that. And then finally, they feel a sense of connectedness globally to humanity, to the earth, and also a desire to connect to parts that they had hated before, or people in their lives that they might have hated before. So that's what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership. There are other qualities like forgiveness often comes naturally, or perspective, or joy. We don't include them partly because they don't begin with the letter C. But these 8 C's are actually the most relevant for the healing process. So we emphasize those.
A message from the Marshal.
Bad tactics on my part, what? Better hunting next
next time.
Can't place that there, my lord. You do not have enough gold to train this unit. Can't place that there, my lord. Not enough gold. No change in the treasury, lord. No change in the treasury, lord. The people worship you, no change in the treasury, lord. The people worship you, in the treasury, lord. The people love you, my lord. Not enough goods. Can't place that there, my lord. Yes, boss.
Game paused.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Dan Pierce, and I'm one of the founders of Mentally Fit. And today we are joined by Dr. Richard Schwartz. He is the founder of the IFS Institute and the creator and developer of the Internal Family Systems Method. You've probably heard of it. You might use it. And I'm really happy that he's here with us today. Dr. Schwartz, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dan. It's an honor to be with you, and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. So I was watching one of your videos that goes over IFS a little bit before we got started here. And one of the core beliefs that you have with IFS is that one, that we all have parts and that these parts are actually sub-personalities. Can you talk to us about a brief overview of what IFS is for someone who doesn't know what it is?
Yeah, that's a good start. The basic assumption is that everyone, in a sense, is a multiple personality. Not everybody has that disorder, but everybody has what I call parts that other systems have called subpersonalities or ego states or things like that, that the mind isn't naturally unitary, but in fact, what we think of as thoughts and emotions are actually emanating from these separate inner personalities, and that's a good thing, that each of them has valuable qualities and resources for us to help us in our lives, and that we're born that way, that it's the natural state of the mind to be that way, that we come into the world with these parts, and at infancy, some of them are online. Infant researchers talk about 5 discrete states that infants rotate through, and then some come on board at different points in your development, but they're all there, either manifested or dormant. And so all that sounds good so far, but trauma and what are called attachment injuries, that is bad parenting, have the effect of forcing them from their naturally valuable states and roles into roles that can be quite destructive ultimately, and have also the effect of freezing them in the time of the trauma, so they're sort of stuck in time. And they believe, for example, Dan, that you're still 5 years old and still very vulnerable, and they have to protect you, for example. and they also, from the trauma, take in what I'm going to call burdens, which are extreme beliefs and emotions that you were feeling or came into your system from that trauma, and then attach to these parts and drive the way they operate, almost like the coronavirus, like a virus. And so good parts force out of their naturally valuable states into roles that might have been necessary to protect you when you were young, but now are anachronistic and don't fit your current life, but they don't know that because they think you are still young and vulnerable. So that's parts, and you know, it's been a tough sell because multiplicity has been so pathologized by these scary reports about multiple personality disorder and so on.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like from what you're saying that we all have these parts within us, but somebody who has multiple personality disorder on one end of the spectrum and somebody who, you know, just feels that inner conflict of like, I want to go to the gym, but I also want to sit down and be lazy. That's potentially the same thing, but on a different range, a different scale. Is that accurate?
Well said, Dan. That's quite accurate. Yeah. So the idea is that these parts are no less full range personalities than the ones that show up in MPD. It's just that for people with that diagnosis, were traumatized so much and so severely as children that their system got blown apart more, and their parts are more polarized, more disconnected from each other. But their being full range personalities is no different from what I'm calling parts inside of us.
Excellent. That makes sense. So you say, and you said before in other videos that you've done that all the parts are inherently good. They have natural, valuable talents and resources, but maybe trauma happens or something external happens to those parts where they kind of react and go into some kind of potentially self-destructive mode that really is trying to help. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how those parts go from that natural state to a traumatized or potentially disordered state?
Yeah, so the analogy I like to use is of a family, obviously internal family systems, where you might have a child who's acting out, and family therapy's big insight was you can't take that kid out of that family and say just cut it out. You've got to understand the whole dynamics and also the history of the family and what happened to produce the need for that role of a kid who's acting out. And so I've extended that to this internal system. And so, yeah, it does turn out that often, let's say you were abused or bullied as a boy, and to protect you back then when you were 5, there was a part of you that kind of made you dissociate and not be here. And so you just didn't feel the impact of the bullying. And that part, like I said, gets frozen in that time and still feels as you grow up like it's got to protect you that way. Whenever some kind of intense, you feel something intense like shame, then immediately you kind of leave. And that gets in your way as you try to do your job and go through life. And you just think, oh, I dissociate. There's some illness I've got, something like that. But if you focus on that dissociating part and get to know it, it'll show you the scene where it's stuck in the past. And if you go and get it out of that time, it will realize that you're not 5 anymore. I don't know how old you are, but you look like you're in your 30s probably.
Yes.
And that, you know, things are a lot safer now. It doesn't have to keep doing this job. And it will then be able to release the extreme beliefs and emotions that got back there, and will immediately transform into some more appropriate and valuable role inside of you.
Nice. That makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like potentially, if you had a part that experienced trauma, and then you just kind of go through your life re-experiencing the reaction of that part to the trauma by disassociating or whatever your reaction is, you kind of perpetuate that, and there's sort of that feedback loop of having the experience and then having the reaction, and it kind of just goes around and around. You mentioned that there's a way to stop that and to get into the memory, to resolve it. What's the process like for that? Is that something that happens in psychotherapy? Can you do that on your own? What do you typically recommend?
Yeah, some people can do it on their own, but a lot of people need at least another person there. Maybe it doesn't have to be a therapist, but they need somebody to help them when they go into these, these dangerous inner neighborhoods. At least they think they're dangerous. Yeah, so the process is, well, let's take a different part. Let's say that in certain contexts, like you see a certain kind of person, you have a kind of panic attack. And again, you just think, what's wrong with me? I'm a grown man. Why do I have so much fear about being with someone like that? And you start to criticize yourself for having the panic attack. Like, why am I such a wimp, and so on. Especially men do that. But if you brought that to me, I would have you focus on that feeling and find it in your body, around your body. And I would ask, once you found it, how do you, Dan, feel toward that scared part of you that gets so panicked? And you would say, I hate it because it's ridiculous. And it blocks me from doing things I want to do. I would say, I can understand why you'd feel that way, but let's just see if we could get the parts of you that have been relating to it that way to give us a break and relax in there so we can just get to know the scared one. And much of the time, most people can do that much, and I would do that until you felt kind of curious about it. And then I would have you ask about its fear. And as you did, you would learn more about why it's so scared and where it is stuck in the past. And then you would start to have not only curiosity for it, but compassion for that younger boy who got stuck back there. And I would help you form a trusting relationship with that part of you. So, and sometimes it takes a while because you've been so hard on him in the past. But once that's in place, I would ask that scared part to show you what happened in the past where it's stuck. And you would see the scenes that to produce that terror. And I could even have you, once the part felt fully what we call witnessed, like you really get what happened and how bad it was, I would say, Dan, now I'd like you to go into that time period and be with that boy in the way he needed somebody. And you would say, okay, I am there. And then I'd say, ask him what he needs you to do back there. And sometimes that can be quite elaborate. He might need you to fight with the bully, or to tell your parents, or to tell the teacher, or do something that actually changes what happens in your inner world. It literally changes the past in a way. And then at some point, when that part felt ready, I would have you take him out of that scene to a safe, comfortable place, which could be in the present with you, or it could be a fantasy place. At which point, most of these parts are willing to give up the burdens, I call it burdens, extreme beliefs and emotions that they got from those times. And so we'll send that out to light, maybe, or fire, or wind. And once the part lets go of that, now this boy feels much lighter and wants to play, and then we can bring in all the parts that hated him to see he's not scared anymore, and they don't have to protect him or terrorize him anymore. And then we help them into new roles too. So that's how it works. And who knew when I started this journey, but it actually does work.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think you touched on a very important point there, and that's the element of compassion. You know, I think a lot of times, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, when we have those inner conflicts, it can be a conflict. You know, our parts can be fully at war with each other at times, and it can feel like you've got, you know, very opinionated voices going back and forth in your head. Your own voice, but just thoughts going back and forth. So I think that element of compassion is very important.
Yeah, and it's hard to have compassion for just random thoughts or emotions. But once you get to know these as inner beings, sacred inner beings, then your heart opens up naturally.
Yeah, that's really great. So I imagine a lot of people who struggle with trauma would benefit from this kind of thing, but I'm sure it can be very triggering for them to get into those memories. Is there anything you recommend from a trauma-informed side of things as far as how people can enter those traumatic memories, start resolving those burdens of the parts without going too far or feeling like they can't handle it?
Yeah, again, if it's chronic and severe trauma, it's tough to do without a therapist. So I'm not necessarily recommending that people even try. But if it isn't that bad, I don't know if bad is the right word, but if it isn't that extensive, then what we learned the hard way was the importance of working with protectors. I don't think I've explained the whole map yet, have I?
No, not yet. Would love to.
Yeah, let me, just to clarify this, let me do that a little bit. So as I was doing all this exploring, and I'm a systems guy, I come from the family therapy world, I was trying to look for patterns of how these parts related to each other. And the big distinction that came up right away was between parts of us that have been called the inner children, that before they were hurt gave us all kinds of wonderful qualities like curiosity and creativity and love and joy and awe and so on. But they're also the most sensitive parts. So when they do get hurt, they take in these burdens of intense worthlessness and shame or terror or emotional pain. And once they get hurt like that, we don't want anything to do with them anymore. And everybody around us, because in the United States, this is a rugged individualist culture, tells us to just leave that in the dust. You know, just move on, don't look back. And so we wind up pushing away those parts and locking them in inner basements or abysses and trying our best to stay one step ahead of them. And not realizing that we're locking away many of our most precious qualities just because they got hurt, thinking we're just moving on from the memories, sensations, emotions, and beliefs. So these we call exiles. And when you get a lot of exiles, you feel a lot more vulnerable, and the world is a lot more dangerous because there's so many things that could trigger them. And if the exile gets triggered, it can overwhelm you and make you feel like you're 5 years old in the middle of that big trauma and make it hard to function in your adult life. So people with a lot of trauma walk around with a lot of fear of triggering their exiles, and they have parts that are forced out of their naturally valuable states into protector roles. And some of the protectors are trying to control the world, control your relationships so no one gets close enough to trigger an exile, control your appearance so you never get rejected, control your performance so you get a lot of accolades to counter the worthlessness. These we call managers. They're trying to manage everything about the external world and also about you so that you don't get triggered. And they're often the critics. They're often, they get such a bad name of these inner critics, but they're just like In family therapy, we call them parentified children. They're just like kids who had to take over and run the system, and they're not equipped, and they don't know what to do but yell at you to get you to behave. And then there are managers who try to take care of everybody and don't let you take care of yourself, and so on. It's a lot of different common manager roles. And so we all have a bunch of managers that got us this far in terms of career and so on. They keep us in our heads so we don't feel too much. But the world has a way of breaking through those defenses and triggering the exiles. And when that happens, it's a big emergency, because there's the danger that you are going to be overwhelmed and feel all that again and not be able to function. So we all have parts who, to get us away from that, are like that dissociative part I talked about earlier, that react immediately to this crisis and try to get you higher than the flames of emotion, or douse them with some substance, or distract you somehow until it burns itself out. So it's a simple map: protectors and exiles, and then two kinds of protectors, managers and firefighters. So all of that to say that we tend to work with protectors before we go to exiles to get permission, because they have a right to not let that happen. And they have to be convinced that it's safe to let the exiles, to let you have access to your exiles. And some people can do that on their own, and a lot of people need somebody like me to help just go over all the fears of the protector and talk about how we can handle each of those.
Excellent. That makes sense. It sounds like what's being developed is a clearer and clearer model of the internal world that we all experience. Would you say that the types of protectors and the types of different roles and characters that people have are relatively consistent, or does that change from person to person?
The types of protectors you have as an individual stay pretty consistent through your life. Across people, there are wide varieties of protectors. They of the protector roles, they generally fit into those three categories, or those two categories of protectors, in the sense that protectors are either trying to preempt anything that might trigger the exiles, or they're reacting after the fact, after the exile has been triggered. So all kinds of roles fit into one of those two categories. But across people, and you know, I could take what's called a DSM diagnosis from psychiatry and give you an alternative way of understanding that diagnosis based on the protectors that dominate that person, that's very non-pathologized, as opposed to the very pathologized diagnosis that somebody gets from being diagnosed.
That's really interesting. Yeah, we've heard a lot recently about how the DSM was not originally intended to be used the way that it's being used. And sometimes it is stigmatizing and pathologizing. Could you give us an example of maybe an alternative way to describe a diagnosis? Say, for example, borderline personality disorder. What is an IFS way to describe that?
Yeah, well, so traditionally, a lot of the complaints about people with that diagnosis are that they can be explosively angry, and they also can be very needy and demanding of therapists or other